All right. Hello, everyone. You are listening to the Blockchain Socials podcast. I'm Josh. I'm here with Primavera and Jessy Kate Schingler here in person at Zuzalu in Montenegro. And so we've brought Jessy Kate to come speak to us because she's been doing a lot of work on extitutional theory with Primavera. And this became a sort of common concept and framework that we use while coming up with our ideas around coordi-nations. But maybe to start, Jessy Kate, would you like to give yourself an introduction for those who don't know you? And then we can get into maybe like a summary of what extitutional theory is. I've talked about it before with Primavera, but I think we need a refresher on that.
Thanks for having me. I think like many people in this community and who've probably come on this podcast, I wear a number of different hats. I've been involved with self-organizing intentional communities for about 20 years with a project that we call the Embassy Network. I work in space exploration and governance with an organization called the Open Lunar Foundation, and we are looking primarily at near and medium-term lunar activities and thinking about positive precedent setting in that domain. And more recently, I'm pursuing extitutional theory research along with Primavera at the CNRS and through the Berkman Klein Institute.
Great. Would you care to give us maybe a quick summary of what extitutional theory is to lay the foundation for the discussion?
Sure. Extitutional theory is still very much a concept or a theory in development, I would say. But for me, it starts with the notion of relational dynamics. And, I think that it's not controversial to propose that relational dynamics are important in our lives. But extitutional theory really looks at the ways in which relational dynamics structure larger scale social organisms, you could say. When we look at, for example, I think across the fabric of human communities, what is it that pulls us into solidarity with one another, into collaboration with one another? These are often not things that start off as institutional projects or collaborations, but there's something more about the pairwise interaction between people that pulls us into wanting to create something that is more kind of structured or lasting or persistent together. Often we find that institutions feel like they're in conflict with our relational dynamics. And I think we see this more and more in society today as our institutions are getting literally bigger, like operating at bigger scale with larger numbers of people. And we tend to end up with this kind of narrative that institutions are somehow undermining our relational dynamics. And I think actually that's true in many cases. Like the way that we design institutions today often doesn't take into account or design specifically for relational dynamics. And so what we want to do with extitutional theory is say, not that institutions are bad, institutions are absolutely necessary, but we want to come up with new design patterns that are actually supportive of and affirmative to relational dynamics so that relational dynamics and institutions are in kind of right relationship with each other, that they are balanced and that they're mutually co-producing as opposed to in tension or fighting with one another.
Yeah, I think whenever we were discussing the Primavera on the first episode that I had her on, we talked a lot about it and kind of like how, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but how sometimes institutions and sort of the social dynamics that underlie them can have a big mismatch, and that there's sort of like extitutional theory kind of brought about just like a term to be able to study those dynamics and how that relates to what is sort of said on paper in the institution versus what is done underneath the surface of it all.
Yeah, we started to use the term institutional scaffolding to think literally about structures that would allow the growth of relational dynamics. So if you think of vines that are growing up the side of a building, or construction scaffolding that makes additional activities possible on the outside of an existing physical building, that notion of scaffolding for me is really helpful because it immediately puts the institution in relationship to these other dynamics that are kind of composed of a different internal physics, if you will. And what we really want to do is we want to understand, how do you design institutions in a way that can support relational dynamics or extitutional dynamics? And similarly, how do extitutional dynamics need or rely on or look to institutions to support them, as opposed to seeing, again, institutions as somehow only undermining relational dynamics.
Like one of the things that we're trying to really explore, and especially now with like the work on coordination, but in general, is an institutional scaffolding necessarily something that will constrain and suffocate extitutional dynamics, or can we come up with institutional scaffolding that are actually almost nurturing and fostering and promoting specific types of extitutional dynamics? And I think these always require to have a dynamic and like foresight, in the sense that when you create an institutional scaffolding today, oftentimes it is in order to either constrain some negative extitutional dynamics or promote some positive ones. But then we need to also think about what happens into the long term, and when something that was created with the intention of promoting specific dynamics in the long term might actually end up constraining the evolution of those extitutional dynamics. And because institutions are static and extitutions are dynamic, anytime we inject some staticity into it, even though it is in order to actually enable and foster new dynamics, it might actually preclude the natural dynamicity and evolution of those. And I think understanding this, like, where is the dynamic equilibrium that exists, and how we can actually ensure that there is, despite the staticity of the institutional scaffolding, how can we ensure that it maintains the capacity of operating in a dynamic manner, or at least allowing for the dynamicity of extitutional dynamics?
I think there's another important aspect of the big picture of extitutional theory, which is this notion of persistence, or sometimes we talk about it as success. Like when we look at social phenomenon, I think we often speak to whether they are successful as being whether the institution continues to exist. And there are many cases where what we have are persistent social phenomenon, but they're fundamentally relational social phenomenon. And that, I think that's really interesting. It's one thing to recognize that a community is important for the success of, let's say, a company, but we're still looking at, is the company still in operation? Not, is this relational creature with a certain pattern integrity, is that still continuing to persist in the world, irrespective of an institutional aspect of it? So I think we're trying to broaden the notion of our understanding, our collective understanding of what does it mean to have sort of sustainable social systems and sustainable social arrangements, and see institutions as one part of a healthy ecosystem of that, but not the only one.
Right. I think, and this I think becomes super related based on, I guess, a couple of things that we kind of identified as the things that people are potentially feeling and identifying with concepts like the network state, is that there is this growing feeling that institutions are failing. Meanwhile, we have these cool crypto tools that are really interesting for perhaps being these institutional scaffolding for extitutional dynamics that are happening within crypto or something like that. And as well, like, just the lack of community and like people wanting to feel like they are a part of something bigger than themselves, especially when they're like perhaps digital nomads that are uprooted from their like national territory that like traditionally would be the place where people would find community. This is an interesting framework to think about basically all these questions that we were mulling over during our 5 days of private workshops.
Yeah, one of the things that I find has been so rich and interesting about being here in Zuzalu is that we really got to talk to a lot of people about what is it that compels them when they hear the term network state. And I think I had my own expectations of what they would say, but I think pretty much every single person that I had the opportunity to ask said that their association with it was actually a relational association. It was this idea that that they don't feel that they have kinship or sort of shared identity with people that they are around in their formal state where they maybe were born. And so that they're sort of like seeking and excited for the kinship that they experience in an environment like this, and that they wanted to build that community and solidarity with. I mean, I guess solidarity is my word, but I heard it. I heard the desire and the hunger really being about this kind of like relational fabric, and yet, my read of the Network State book is really fundamentally an institutional proposal. Like it's not,
right.
It doesn't talk about relational dynamics at all. It really talks about establishing the institutional infrastructure that, eventually after the 7-step process eventually results in diplomatic recognition. And so I think part of what we saw is that there is a kind of gap there. There's a lot that simply wasn't treated in the network state, even if you have a very neutral interpretation of the network state's structural proposal, that there's this like massive space that we felt it's important to explore for the kinds of social phenomena that we personally are interested in, and that based on the people that we're talking to, it's anecdotal, but the kinds of things that people around us are hungry for as well.
And also, I think discussing with the people, I think this is like I would say what you're describing is the constructive approach of why we want something new. There is also the subtractive approach of why there is a resonance to network state, which is the idea of escaping from a particular framework that is too constraining, right? And so in particular, like the longevity people and or like even the crypto people, where all of a sudden there are new technologies that apparently provide new opportunities, and those opportunities cannot be explored because of the institutional scaffolding of the state, which has particular constraint on what you can or cannot do. And all of a sudden, this is also a very strong component that brings resonance with the way in which Balaji describes the network state, because you want to escape or exclude yourself from those systems, and I think what we're gonna discuss during this episode as well is like, do we really need to go all the way, as Balaji tries to argue, that we need to create a completely new state in order to escape from some of the institutional scaffolding of the state, or can we actually find little enclaves within the institutional structure of the state in which we can operate more freely, which brings us to the question of exclosure. So maybe Jessy Kate, you can give us a little extitutional introduction to exclosure. And I think what when we're formalizing the notion of coordi-nations, I think we need to think about both those questions of, one, how do we create a better relational fabric with people that there is really a sense of tribe and affinity with, and how do we also create an institutional scaffolding which is not designed to reproduce the state, but rather to exclose from the extensive grid that the state has provided.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exclosure is one of our
sexy terms.
Yeah, one of our favorite terms. And to describe exclosure, I think it's useful to start with enclosure, because exclosure is different than enclosure. Enclosure is, I think we all have a kind of intuitive familiarity with the notion of enclosure, but if you think about some enclosed social dynamics or even institutional dynamics, you might think of a company or an organization, an institution like a university or something like that. And that institution will have a set of rules and roles associated with it, and those the interactions within that institutional framework are sort of enclosed, and they have a certain a domain of operation, you could say. But there's a lot of interaction between that institution and the world outside of it. And so the interactions that take place according to the rules and roles of that institution are very much visible by and legible to the institutions outside of it as well. And as we were exploring this idea of extitutional dynamics and what institutional scaffolding might look like, we noticed that in some cases there are institutional designs that actually seem to almost like hide the social dynamics that take place inside of them and make those social dynamics a bit invisible to the surrounding institution. And that creates this kind of fascinating opportunity to, this is what we call an exclosure. And it's this opportunity to kind of, to explore or experiment with fundamentally different kind of internal physics of how you might organize yourself within that exclosed area. So one of the examples that we like to think about is the Berkman Klein Center or other kind of academic environments where there are these kind of very strong communities that of let's say affiliates. So I'm also involved with the Ostrom workshop, and I think they do this very well as well, where they have a community of people that they give an official title, an official role, like you are an affiliate with the Berkman Klein Center. And through that is an institutional role. So the institution knows how to see that I am an affiliate. But once you get into the group of affiliates, there's no particular requirements of what I do as an affiliate besides obviously there's some basic things like, don't defame the university's reputation, stuff like that. But besides that, what we do as affiliates is not a structured interaction. It's very much a totally dynamic relational set of interactions. And often the reason why universities do this is that the most incredible work is produced in these environments, but the institution itself doesn't regulate or codify the dynamics that are happening within that exclosure. And so again, I relate this to the notion of prefiguration as well. Like an exclosure creates this environment where we can potentially prefigure futures that we would like to see exist.
Just to be like, maybe to, I don't know, to be the critic, is that like, because it sounds to me, because I'm not in the academic world, maybe I'm just kind of dumb on this, but it sounds to me like this type of thing is almost like is it because it's an exclusive club to be a part of? Is that part of it? I don't think it doesn't have to be exclusive. I think the important sort of definitional components is that there is a kind of boundary that's created where the people who are part of that exclosure, or at least some of them, have an institutional role. But as a result of that institutional role, and this is a design question, like how you create exclosures is a whole other podcast, let's say. But there are people who straddle the institutional and the extitutional realm and create this kind of protective bubble within which these other social dynamics can take place.
I think I will add maybe like one of the distinguishing feature of an exclosure as opposed to a club or to any type of like social gathering is that the exclosure is invisible to the institution because the membrane that it uses in order to shape its community is something that speaks exactly the same language of the institution, so that the institution cannot see through, right? And so as opposed to a club, like if we create like a, membership club of something, there is nothing that prevents the institution from stepping in if the club is doing stuff that the institution doesn't like. When you actually create an exclosure, it's a little bit more powerful because you understand precisely the rules of the institution, and you are crafting the membrane of the exclosure in such a way that there is no possible penetration of the institution inside the exclosure, right? So the exclosure is an enclosure within an enclosure. And so you're carving out a space of freedom from the external enclosure. And because it is made of the same fabric, because it is speaking exactly the same language, then the only way for the institution to penetrate within the exclosure is to actually violate its own rules, and therefore self-defeating itself. So this is the magic, and I think this is very relevant when we talk about network state and coordination, is if there is an underlying desire of escaping from the institutional grids that a particular state has created, then either you have to move away from the enclosure of the state, which is Balaji's solution of, well, let's declare sovereignty, and therefore the state we are no longer part of the enclosure of the state, we are now our own enclosure. Or, and this is what we are advocating for, let's stay within the enclosure of the state, because there is many grids that we are actually fine with, but within that enclosure, let's craft our own exclosure so that the state doesn't get in. And we can therefore operate with greater degrees of freedom without having to completely separate ourselves from the territory and from the sovereignty of the state.
I think that also brings us to an important concept that we've been discussing a lot over the past week or so, which is the notion of sovereignty. And we've been talking about this question or this idea of kind of layered sovereignties. Sovereignty as not being, within the state context, we often think about sovereignty as this kind of hegemonic phenomena. And the notion of sovereignty within the coordi-nations idea is much more about this kind of like coexisting, but sort of like mutually autonomous and perhaps exclosed from each other layers of sovereignty. And that to me is a really important distinction. And it's also experientially, it's a quality of the world that I seek. Like I don't want to create entirely kind of isolated bubble of existence from the rest of the world, but I'd like to create kind of these pockets of autonomy that somehow are themselves persistent and kind of self-reliant, but also are able to interact with and navigate and be in relationship with these other pockets. And so sovereignty and exclosure, I think, have this intimate relationship with each other that are fascinating for me to explore.
Yeah, and I think this is particularly relevant to the work we've done in the sense that the traditional way of seeing things in a more institutional manner is that you cannot have sovereignty if you are subject to someone else's sovereignty. And what we're trying to develop here is more of a conceptualization of multiple layers of overlapping sovereignties. And you can actually be sovereign in a particular domain while also being subject to someone else's sovereignty in a broader, larger scale domain. And I think exploring those overlapping jurisdictions and additional layer of sovereignties is really what distinguishes the coordination type of work we're doing from the more traditional and institutional Balaji style of network states.
I mean, even the idea that sovereignty can ever be pure is itself, I think, a fallacy. Like, and it often gets talked about as a paradox. Like you talk about, if you read, Homo Sacer or something like that, the whole book is about the paradox of sovereignty. But I actually don't think of sovereignty as a paradox. I think that sovereignty is kind of mutually co-constituted, even in the construct of the nation state or the Westphalian state. Sovereignty exists through peer recognition, among other features. And so this idea of kind of enriching that landscape of sovereignties is, to me, it's actually like in high integrity with the fundamental concept as I understand it.
So let's go back to the basics, and let's try and map the notions that we have developed in the context of extitutional theory with the more traditional concept of nation and states and nation states and network states and coordi-nations. So maybe Jessy Kate, you can give us a little introduction to like to which extent those nation relates to institution, to which extent of the state relates to the institution, and how do you see the notion of nation states and network states and our new concept of coordi-nations to interface with those two concepts of institution and extitution?
Simplistically, I guess you could see the state is an institutional construct and the nation is an extitutional construct. And when we think about nation, we spend a lot of time talking about the concept of nation, and itself, is also probably worth a podcast. But there are these qualities that we associate with kind of national identity, of shared identity, shared belonging. In, let's say, traditional national concept of nationality, you might say shared history or even inherited identity or history or cultural norms. When we start to think about the network state or coordi-nations, the network state is, as we were already discussing, is an institutional concept predominantly. And, I think if Balaji was here, Balaji might say, well, it wasn't my attempt to describe the relational fabric of the network state. I was describing the institutional construct. And what we were doing was actually, I think, starting more from the extitutional side, the sort of national identity side. But there are some observations that we were making that if you take the concept of national identity and you look at the world that we live in today, there are a lot of people who are kind of constructing a very, very deep sense of belonging and identity outside of those inherited national identities, those sort of like, you might call them the classic or the traditional notion of national identity. And so we feel that there is something that's like nation-like or nation-ish, or maybe like finding your tribe, or, there's many different words that we could use for it. Something that's happening these days in the world that relies on kind of networked communication and coordination, and that is kind of that's this new landscape across which these identities are being produced. And it's on some level it's our hypothesis that the ability to produce identity in this way, or for identity to emerge and grow and develop in this way, that might well lead to a different kind of quality to the national identity, or whatever we want to call it. And as a result, that it also might warrant or rely on a slightly modified institutional form. So what is the evolution of, let's say, the concept of national identity, and what is, as a result, the evolution of the concept of the institutional scaffolding that identity might warrant?
Right. This is, I'm getting too Deleuzian here, but I feel that like capital has sort of deterritorialized our sort of traditional relationships with territory, with land, with local existence and shared history through globalization, through like the ability to move anywhere and for capital to go anywhere mostly. And so now we're at a point where people, just as humans, still have this desire for kinship and community, but the institutions that sort of govern over them don't fit kind of like the deterritorialized space now of what their declaring their sovereignty over that, so people are being coerced into. So there's this huge contradiction for people, and so I guess like crypto is this interesting potential for institutional scaffolding, and Balaji, I think, was like one attempt, although he probably, I don't know if he agrees with exactly this reasoning or like this trajectory as to what caused this situation, but it's perhaps an attempt at trying to reconcile those things.
I think it's good that you mentioned sort of like crypto and these new forms of organizing. There's two things that makes me think of. One is that we were actually talking the other day about the fact that we were surprised that despite sort of the network state book being situated very much in a kind of like modern technological landscape and being written by somebody who's embedded in Silicon Valley and the venture capital world and technology, that it doesn't actually really look deeply at the ways in which technology is kind of able to be instrumented for new forms of organizing.
Right. And that's what's so frustrating.
It's a bit, not only is it frustrating, but to me, it links to what is potentially, or to me, it is perhaps central to what is different about these new national-like identities, which is that they are, I mean, among other things, obviously they're, so that you have this kind of networked coordination and communication that is enabling this production of identity and shared belonging. As a result, it's not inherited. It's something that people are actually finding each other and kind of co-creating.
Right.
And so that's kind of new, right? Because historically, again, that level of identification was something that you kind of received. Like you are Jewish, you are Arab, you are even like you're Canadian, whatever you are. But these days, what we find is people are traveling around the world to not just find, but to build that depth of like nation-like or tribe-like identity with other people.
I mean, the Balajian approach is like trying to make a nation-ish type of thing through people who like keto or like want to get rid of the FDA or whatever as being like something, but of course it misses I guess the actual things that you need to create a community, which I think we identified as being kinship, as not necessarily alignment, so not agreeing necessarily with a particular thing, but like that there is mutual support and solidarity, that if something happens to you, then I'll be there for you, and if something happens for me, then I'll be there for you.
Which importantly is super different from us all agreeing on something. Like if we have a depth of relationship, then if you feel like we should invest more in agriculture and I feel like we should invest more in education, then we have a basis on which to have a discussion with one another. But it also, it makes clear why having some commentary on the kind of internal aspects of voice versus simply characterizing exit, like why that's so important, because kinship needs to coexist with some form of our ability to navigate and reconcile differences with each other.
Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out, and join the newest patrons like Sergio, which really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did, and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I actually recorded a video of myself giving a reaction to a clip from a recent episode of the Deep program when they interviewed Hassan Piker, which had a lot of relevance to when it comes to left-wing organizing internationally. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out.
I also want to introduce the concept of interdependence because I think this is actually tackling also into that, meaning that it seems to me that in the past, before having easy transportation means and networked communications, we were deeply, deeply interdependent of our neighbors. and or people that are part of the same territory. And so all of a sudden, I feel like this feeling of kinship is also a feeling that emerges from a sense of interdependence, meaning that I am here for you and you are here for me because we are in it together. And somehow I feel that two things have happened with the internet is that on the one hand, I mean, internet and mobility, on the one hand, we feel less interdependent of our local neighbors, and we feel, on the other hand, more interdependent with people that are not at all associated with our territory. And then we choose, because now we choose to create new type of interdependencies with people that we feel an affinity with, because that's the one we want to be interdependent with. So I feel also like, because I'm thinking like, why do we feel kinship with people that just live on the same territory? There's such a large variety of people, and of course there is culture and ethnicity and things like this, but the reality is that we are part of the same thing, and we are subject to the same, law of natures and institutional frameworks. And so all of a sudden we create kinship because of the existing interdependence. And interestingly, it feels to me that when we move into the digital, we are actually creating interdependencies because we have kinship. And eventually it is both this feeling of kinship and interdependence. Which one is the chicken and which one is the egg is really hard to tell. But that's what actually triggers a desire of coordinating together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, what keeps coming back, it seems that creates kind of a shared identity, is shared struggle. Like, to me, that seems to keep coming back. I mean, at some point, we were humans were cavemen who just kind of like freely, I guess, associated with each other because they're right next to each other and they're probably family. And eventually, like, culture kind of was created because of the material conditions in which they lived in. So, like, I mean, of course, you're going to have a different type of culture around, like, I don't know, groups of humans that were living near rivers versus living in the middle of the desert versus living in the jungle or whatever else, just because of the, like, physical manifestation of the struggle that they have to go through. And so, like, the creation of national identities, even before the internet, is always like the cultural practices that you do is just based on how have you historically overcome these struggles that everyone else in your territory have also overcome. And what's really extremely fucked up about, like, the Balaji network state we were talking about earlier with his, like, really crazy quote about manifest destiny that was extremely racist, was he cites, like, manifest destiny, which was like this struggle for white people to move across the continent all the way to the West. And that has, I mean, it's not wrong. That has, like, created the identity of American culture and it is like a root of what it is today. And, he will say that's a good thing. I will say that's a very problematic thing. But I think now we're at a point where our struggles that we experience are not just territorially bound, or the struggles that we identify with are not territorially bound, but have become perhaps also more abstract.
That brings me back to something that Primavera was saying earlier, which is that in the concept of coordi-nations, the idea as we've conceived of it, in this intensive workshop over the last week or so altogether, was actually not as a territorial construct, but actually something that in many cases might rely affirmatively on a territorial state construct. So the idea is we have those constructs, and I have in my mind the notion of, like, a thick state and a thin state. And traditionally, perhaps, we grew these, like, thick Westphalian states. And then, as you were saying, we kind of began to thin them out, or perhaps, like, make them a bit more porous through globalization and economic interdependence. And there's this kind of, like, Primavera has a great diagram that maybe we can include in the show notes somewhere. But what we're exploring is this kind of, like, middle layer, perhaps, of, like, mutualism and solidarity that, again, makes, I think it's not about, it's not sort of about being anti like territorial state, but I think it is about thinning out the state to where its core competencies lie. And the reason that I'm talking about this is because I think that this ability to kind of find people and choose who to enter into shared struggle with, in many cases relies on the fact that these like basic territorial functions are handled. Like we have roads, we have airports that we can go to physically to fly to the places that we meet all our new kin with. So it's not that territorial management isn't needed anymore. Like obviously we need that, and it's an important function in the world. How we want to do that, or obviously the spectrum of states out there is wide, and some of them are what you might call good, and some of them are what you might call bad. But I do think we need something at the territorial level, and then you get into this sort of like more affirmative notion of who do I want to be kin with, and that's just such an important part of the engine of I think of building beautiful, solidaristic, and sort of like sustainable social communities. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I was beginning to get into reading the Network State book, at one point I was a bit confused because, perhaps because I'm a bit overly biased towards thinking about governance structures and decision-making structures. And so I was like, where do we talk about this? And so I started to like Command F, search for certain words in the book. And I was looking for the word care. And I was looking for the word poor. And mental health is like, obviously it's a particular phrasing, but like I was just poking around for words like this, and I didn't find them. And to me, shared struggle is also a bit about like, if one person is struggling, like, how do we swarm around them? Like or if lots of people are struggling, like how do we build systems that can be, that can kind of like heal and sustain and persist around people who are in different states, or even different states of agreement or different states of thriving. And that feels like a really important part of, like a really important quality that I think we were grasping for in the work that we've been doing.
Maybe I think it might be interesting if you want to talk about like if we get more practical, because I think you have experience in living in intentional communities, which came up a lot in our discussions, and like what it is like to live in this type of living arrangement, and how probably a lot of people who are interested in network states actually just want an intentional community. But could you maybe talk a bit about your experience with intentional communities, and like what are the like, I don't know, practical things that you found around creating kinship in creating like a healthy intentional community?
Yeah, it's a very rich question. So I'll try and like find some...
Not a straightforward one, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. But I'll try and, maybe bring in some salient points. I mean, in my experience, our starting point was deciding that we wanted to live together in order to create an environment that was, I would say, permissive of like rich intellectual explorations and focused on hospitality. And that, it was like quite basic on some level, right? We wanted to be around people who inspired us and make sure that it was easy for all of our extended community members to be around us. But I think in some ways, accidentally, we stumbled into some properties that we're seeing now kind of come up in the coordi-nations work and concept. One of those being an ability to be in a kind of like solidaristic relationship with the outside world, not just the internal world. So as a result of hosting lots of events and an emphasis on hospitality and like accommodations, it means that our communities are very much always receiving new inputs, new material, new ideas, and new activities. And that, I think that those inputs create a kind of like ongoing engine for change and innovation and like positive shared experience, but also something where we have to navigate that together. And so through doing that, we end up with this sort of like shared struggle, or, having disagreements about how many events we should have or how we should spend our money or whatever it is. And coming through that to the other side creates then also that shared sense of identity and kinship and all these other things. I didn't actually talk that much about the embassy itself, but I can do that if we would like.
Actually, I'm very curious because the more we think about the network state and coordination work, the more I have this internal admiration for the name Embassy Network. So I would love if you can actually give us a little bit of a sneak peek into like what is it that actually motivated the name, and do you feel that the name and is there a performativity as well to the name that was given to this network, but especially like why did you call it the Embassy Network?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that, because these days I almost feel a bit sheepish about the name, because I think it's a very Western term, and I'm like way more familiar now with all of the colonial implications of that term than my 20 whatever 4-year-old self might have been. But the inspiration for the term Embassy Network was that we wanted to create or be part of a network of places around the world that, like our kind of naive concept of an embassy, that an embassy was in our minds a place where you go and you can always find people who speak your language and share your culture, and that they are kind of like little exclaves or exclosures from the environment around them. And and so the Embassy Network was these embassies were embassies to the future that we were all co-creating. But they're each sort of they're each different, and they're in different locations, and they have different internal kind of like the embassy. If you're thinking about like the Canadian embassy or something like that, the embassy in Sudan is going to be different than the embassy in China, is going to be different than the embassy in the United States. But there's a familiarity there, or like this concept of pattern integrity that we talk of a lot.
I want to talk about the performativity of the name, because I think it's actually, so one thing interesting is that you could have called it embassy, but you called it Embassy Network. And in some way, personally, I have only experienced Embassy San Francisco in terms of the thing that, at least up to now that there is emerging, it's hard to tell, but up to the time in which it was still the Embassy Network as an embassy network. But what's interesting is that, and then other communities have been inspired and spin out some their own manifestation. But what's interesting is that I think if it was just called, embassy or maybe any name, it would be harder, I think, for someone that comes and visit the embassy to actually even think about the fact that this can be spin off. And because it was called the Embassy Network, then anyone can relate to the idea, well, if it's a network, I can become a node of the network. And my intuition, and I'm curious what you think, is that the fact that the Embassy Network has managed to inspire and spin off many different instances, whether or not they became part of the Embassy Network or not, is because it was not presented through the naming as a single instance, but rather as a network of nodes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that's a fascinating question, and I'm going to get into it, but one thing I'll say is that kind of in support of your point, often people don't even know whether to call the location in San Francisco, the embassy or the Embassy Network. Like they're kind of like, I'm a bit confused. Like, is this the Embassy Network or the embassy? But I actually think that the idea of the Embassy Network, I want to tell a bit of a story about that, because when we first started calling what we were doing the Embassy Network, or using that term, we, like so many other communities, I think we were both starting the first node and we had aspirations of creating a network. And so we narrated it a lot. We talked about, we were like building our local community, but then we would kind of go out in the world and we would say, and we're building a network. And we would kind of have this like, who wants to join together and create a network together? And what actually, just like over the last week, as we've been doing this work, an insight that it gave me is that because at the very beginning, we were just one node, but we were narrating it as a network, I think a lot of people were like, well, what's the formal way to join it? And we're not sure. And we didn't want to create this like hyper institutionalized form of joining the network or what membership looks like. And so it was always this kind of murky thing. And we never really settled on something that was concrete. And I think many other people kind of received it as, well, you're just one node. Who are you to go and like create the network? Like, why would we join your network? Why wouldn't you join our network? Or why wouldn't we create a network together? But we weren't talking about it that way. And so in my experience, retrospectively, the notion of the network, we like came out of the gate fast with the idea of a network. But then it actually, I would say, kind of receded into the background for many years as we didn't quite crystallize into a network, but we did. So the network, the idea of the network kind of receded into the background for a bit. And then we actually just formed authentic, meaningful relationships with other communities. And we weren't fussed about calling it a network or not. We were just like, we're just relating to each other. We're exchanging members of the community. We're sharing documentation. We're sometimes lending each other money, whatever. But it was totally informal. And now, fast forward like 10 years, and now there are all these different nodes, and they're legitimately kind of autonomous nodes, but we have real ongoing relationships with one another. And what I notice is that the term embassy network is sort of starting to get re-adopted by members of those nodes in a way that I don't feel like I've had any particular role or say in. So I'm trying to think about if that supports or undermines your hypothesis, but I do think that there is a performativity to the word network. And I guess if you look at that whole arc, what I would say is that the performativity isn't always positive, right? Like it was performing in that way at the beginning. And that's actually why I think it was hard to build the network, because we weren't quite ready to be peers as autonomous communities creating that network. But now that we feel that strength and that we've, achieved a kind of internal self-reliance and like autopoiesis is the word we've been using, now we can almost engage with that concept of network in a more sophisticated way that I think is more likely to constitute something that looks like a coordination.
And just to continue a little bit to riff on naming, I think it's also interesting the extent to which when you have like communities which each have their own names, and then when those communities start to have such extensive degrees of not just interaction, but really cross-pollination, meaning that at some point it becomes difficult to tell whether one person belongs to one, the other, bot, or maybe something else, right? And what is this something else? And to which extent is the mere fact of naming that something else and give it a proper independent name, to which extent does that actually manifest itself? Or to which extent does it facilitate? It's kind of an intention, right? Mm-hmm. It's like we intend to recognize this as its own overarching or umbrella entity. And by the mere fact that now we have something to refer to, then this thing starts actually instantiating itself into the world. And I think we've seen it a little bit with like Embassy, Fetopia, Wilbur, etc. And I think there is a desire to find the right name, and it's difficult to find a good name. But like, what is this thing? Like, to which extent is like just when does this state change arrive in which we are no longer just a set of independent community interfacing and interacting with one another, and when do we become a multicellular organism that has its own identity?
I don't know if you can see it in the moment. I think it might be one of those things where it's kind of like asking, when does a liquid become a gas? It's like it is a fundamental phase change that you know that it's happened once it's sort of like more comprehensively complete. But in the precise moment, I think it's really subtle. And I do think that it's a delicious question. And I think that the act of naming is itself this kind of like mysterious again, delightfully mysterious phenomenon where somehow it creates this like lightning rod where people can begin to orbit around a concept. And so to the extent, I mean, I guess, what are things that are associated with the name kind of catalyzing that phase change? Certainly it's using the name, right? Like beginning to refer, not at the expense of the name that you've already been using. So if you're a node in that is constituting a network, it's not that you would stop using your individual node's name, but as you begin to, it's almost like calling in like a spirit guide or something like that, right? Like the name itself is this thing that you begin to refer to, and you kind of co-produce it as you're referring to it, as you discuss it. That brings in the relationality where we can kind of navigate amongst different nodes. How do you feel about this name? What do you associate with this name? What do you attribute to this name? And I can hear what you're saying, and I can begin to internalize that, respond to it. You understand what I see. And then through that, we kind of scaffold, no pun intended, into the identity of the name itself.
So maybe just like to bring this wonderful episode to a closing, I'm curious about, so within extitutional theory, we've been discussing a lot about the extent to which the institutions can be a driver for competition, but inside the institution, because there is like less space, there's a limited amount of space to who can be member and what are the roles within those members, but also outside, because since you identify something as a box, and then all of a sudden this thing, the survival of the box, i.e. the institution, needs to compete with the environment against the other boxes, as opposed to when we move into the extitutional dynamics, orbiting dynamics and so forth. We have this intuition, at least, that there is more of a cooperative potential, and so bringing this to the question of comparing and contrasting the Balaji's vision of network state, which is actually likely to be in competition with existing nation states, versus our idea of coordi-nations that operate as additional layers. To which extent do you see that the coordi-nation is more prone to facilitate cooperation and collaboration rather than competition?
Yeah, I think that in the conception of the network state, as I understand it, it's, I would say, like a kind of flatter concept. Like it sort of projects or like really only describes social interactions through these fairly institutional constructs. And I do think institutions inherently have a stronger characteristic of being in maybe not always competition with each other, but that they are often operating in environments of like fundamental scarcity of one way, shape, or form. And that's not like I don't mean that in a valenced way. I mean that in just like a practical, technical sense. And so institutions tend to exist in domains that require navigating some form of scarcity or competition. Sometimes they do that well, sometimes they do that less well. And in that sense, the network state concept, given that it exists primarily in that institutional domain, is more likely to be in a constantly navigating that kind of environment, or sorry, those kinds of dynamics. What I think is introduced by this notion of coordi-nations is this additional dimensionality. Like we kind of like blow open the notion of these new, let's say, these new domains of sovereignty outside of just the institutional structure, and we add these other layers that are fundamentally extitutional. And extitutional relationships and dynamics, I think, both function well in and tend to produce environments of abundance and kind of local navigation of mutual support. And in that sense, I think that we're like adding space for many of the dynamics that constitute these coordi-nations to occur outside of institutional constructs. And what that does is that makes room for an additional sort of cooperative approaches or environment.
Nice. So I think we will end it there. Thank you so much, Jessy Kate, for coming on and sharing your experience and wisdom with us on that you shared with us throughout all the workshops.
Thank you. It's been fun jamming with you for the last couple weeks.
You can say that you're sick of me now.